grateful to the Abigail Adams Institute for this opportunity. Thank you to all of you, people at Harvard University, people from all over the world, and Venezuelans who are here with us this afternoon. And I say thank you because this is a really important topic. What is happening in Venezuela is unprecedented for a country of the size of Venezuela, a country that was or used to be very rich, that used to be democratic, to be in this situation. And I think there are several lessons that not only Venezuelans can learn from this experience, but people from all over the world. And I want to remind you that even though this will be an academic presentation with a ton of numbers, statistics that sometimes are very cold by their nature, these statistics of poverty, of inequality, of hyperinflation mean something. They fundamentally change the life of millions of people. They divide families, they break families. And that's why it's really important to always have that on the back of our minds. Because that way, we remind ourselves that these things matter. Studying these things matter for millions of people all over the world. With that being said, there's of course two objectives of the talk. The first one is for Venezuelans, for people like me, that if we really study what went wrong in our country and we draw the proper lessons and conclusions from the collapse and the humanitarian crisis of our country, then we will be able to identify, formulate, and implement the right policies for our future. So that way we can have a country that is prosperous again, that grows again, and that provides opportunities again. And from people from all over the world, by studying the Venezuelan economic collapse, then you can see what policies should not be repeated in your countries. So that way you have a guideline, or you have the abilities or the tools to avoid future Venezuelans, future cases in which countries turn from democratic and prosperous towards economically collapsed and politically as well. So with that being said, let's begin the workshop. Many professors give their main claim at the end of their lectures or of their talks. I'm not one of them. I will try to give you my main claim right now. So that way you have a framework for the rest of the lecture. And that way you can also spot inconsistencies in my claim. So that way we can advance the knowledge that we have on the Venezuelan crisis. So my main claim will be the following. When people read or people talk in the news, among policymakers, in universities, people tend to link the Venezuelan collapse to external factors, mainly two factors. The decline oil prices had in the mid-2010s, and more recently, the United States sanctions against the Venezuelan government. These two external factors are often used by analysts and policymakers to explain why the country collapsed. And what I will argue is that that argument is wrong. And it's wrong for several reasons that we'll explain further in today's lecture, and of course, more in detail in the paper that was distributed before, paper that I aim to publish this year. My argument is that the collapse of the Venezuelan economy was the result, or is the result, of an institutional deterioration that the country had, as a result of an institutional setting that was first implemented by the government of Hugo Chavez, and then continued by the government of Nicolas Maduro. Specifically, two sets of institutions, two institutional settings. One related to the oil economy and another one related to the non-oil economy. In regards to the oil economy, my argument is that the collapse in oil production was not the result of external factors, but of the politicization of the oil industry, specifically the politicization of its operations, and more importantly, perhaps, the politicization of its finances, because it led to underinvestment, it led to a depletion in the know-how of the company, and it led to mismanagement and loss in productivity as a result. And then the second set of institutions were related to the non-oil economy of Venezuela. The primary set of institutions that caused the collapse of the non-oil economy was a series of institutions that substitute market mechanism with central planning from the government, such as widespread expropriations, coercion controls, price caps, and production quotas. These institutions destroy the market of Venezuela, the system of relative prices, and all the coordination that occurs in a free economy. And the second kind of institution, the second kind of institution were a series of institutions that are key for growth, that the Venezuelan government started to don't provide effectively, such as monetary stability, fiscal stability, and public goods such as infrastructure, electricity supply, water supply, and collective security. These institutions, or the lack of these institutions, also created many issues in the Venezuelan economy. And my argument is that these institutions are the cause of the Venezuelan collapse. That's the main claim. So with that being said, I will try to structure, or I will try to explain this claim in the following manner. I will begin by giving you the magnitude of the Venezuelan economic collapse. So that way you have a perspective, or you have a snapshot of how is Venezuela right now, today, and how big was the collapse. Why do you see Venezuela over the news? Why do you see Venezuela over the news over and over again? So you need to see the magnitude first. Then I will try to explain the two paradoxes about the Venezuelan economy. Then I will explain the oil sector of the economy, then the non-oil sector of the economy, and I will finish by drawing some lessons and conclusions about the Venezuelan collapse. So let's begin by the magnitude of the Venezuelan collapse. Since 2013, in a time span of 7 years, just 7 years, Venezuela has lost over 75% of its gross domestic product. So that means that 3/4 of the economy are gone by now in just a period of 7 years. Venezuela since 2017 has experienced hyperinflation. Venezuela since 2015 has been the country with the highest misery index of any country. And as a result, today, 96% of Venezuelans live in poverty. Almost 80% of Venezuelans live in extreme poverty. And hyperinflation is at almost 4,000% this year. Right now, only 60% of Venezuelans, only 40% of Venezuelans, eat less than 2,000 calories per day. This has resulted in a severe humanitarian crisis that, as a result, 85% of medicines are not in Venezuela. 61% of schools do not have water in their communities, and the supply, and 60% of hospitals do not have electricity. And 5 million people, Venezuelans, have left the country in the past years. So the situation in Venezuela is dramatic, it's unprecedented. The collapse of Venezuela is the worst in the modern history of the Western Hemisphere, and it's unprecedented because it did not involve any civil war or a war with another country or any natural disaster. It was caused by policies of the government. And this has two paradoxes, as I said. The first paradox is that Venezuela has the highest oil reserves of any country on earth. Venezuela, at one point in its history, was the second largest producer of oil in the world. Venezuela, moreover, in the 2000s, had the highest oil bonanza in its history of almost $1 trillion of extra revenues just from oil. because oil prices increased by 500% during the Chavez administration. Just to put you a context of the amount of money that came in Venezuela during the Chavez administration, at almost $1 trillion in oil revenues represents 10 times the GDP that Venezuela had in 1998. And it is a paradox, and after that, Venezuela is now in a humanitarian crisis. The second paradox is that Venezuela, up until the 1970s or 1998, was an example of economic development. Venezuela, in fact, until the 1970s, was the economy that grew the most per capita terms among all countries. From 1920 to 1980, Venezuela's GDP grew by 6.4% per annum. From 1940 to 1998, manufacturing output per capita grew at a 4% rate. And by the 1970s, the country has 2.5 times the GDP of the South American average, was among the 20th highest GDP in the world, and in the region, it had the highest income per capita, social mobility, and economic freedom of any Latin American countries. For this reason, it is a paradox to all of us who study economics what is going on in Venezuela. Because one will argue that after having a good trajectory of economic growth, then with this amount of oil that came during the 2000s and until 2013, you will see Venezuela finding ways to jumpstart their economy even more, to overcome basic and conventional development constraints that middle-income countries have, such as a low tax rate or a low savings rate. But no, it happened the opposite. So that's the question that we're trying to answer. What happened here? So let's begin talking about the oil economy. What happened in the oil economy? Why is this important? Because oil represents the biggest income of the Venezuelan economy and the Venezuelan state. Look what happened in the oil economy. By 1998, the PDVSA, who is the oil industry of the Venezuelan state, was among the 3 biggest in the world, was well managed, and it used to produce 3.5 million barrels per day at the time. And it used to refine 1 million barrels of gasoline per day. That was in 1998. Now, in 2020, our average was 500,000 barrels per day of oil production. And of oil refining, the numbers are difficult to find, but all of them says that we are refining right now less than 50,000 barrels of gasoline per day, which is the reason that Venezuela right now, despite being an oil exporter country, an oil producer country, right now we have shortages of gasoline, chronic shortages of gasoline in the country. And on top of that, right now, PDVSA, the oil industry, does not have any oil drilling rigs operating. This is serious because if this continues, there will be a moment in which Venezuela will stop producing oil at all, marking the end of Venezuela as an oil-producing country. So you see this collapse in the main source of revenue of Venezuela. So when people talk about what happened in the oil sector, they predominantly talk about one cause, one external cause, as I said, which is that because of the United States sanctions that they imposed in August 2017, because of that, the oil production in Venezuela has collapsed. Specifically, they argue that the sanctions blocked Venezuela's access from the financial markets, and as a result, Venezuela did not have the capital to maintain or even increase production. The most popular academic research on this matter was done by Jraissati and Weisbrot in May 2019. To make their claim, they said that Venezuela's production collapsed right after the sanctions. And they put as a counterfactual the Colombia's oil production. They said that from 2010 to 2017, production in Venezuela and Colombia were similar, but since the sanctions, production in Colombia has increased, while production in Venezuela has collapsed. And as a result of this counterfactual, they argue that the sanction should be the ones who cause this collapse. The problem is that there are several problems with such a theory. First of all, if you put Colombia as a counterfactual, a rule of thumb is that you need to go as deep as you go in your counterfactual. They did not. They put from 2013 to 2017. Just by going back to 2010, you see that the production of Venezuela and Colombia were not similar from 2010 to 2013. So that's the first issue. The second issue is why they chose Colombia, another country who was declining in its oil production. Why they didn't choose other OPEC countries, other oil-producing countries, because it did not fit their narrative. In the period that Venezuela was declining oil production, all other OPEC countries were increasing production after the oil boom. And then the third problem with their argument is that Venezuela did not have the access towards credit and financial system to borrow money to maintain production. Why Venezuela did not have the money in the first place, that's a question that they don't entertain. And the second one is that even if you validate that argument, Venezuela's access to the financial system was already closed by them. And we can make this argument by just looking at the financial record of the Venezuelan government in 2016, 1 year before the sanctions. That year, the Venezuelan government, through its oil industry, PDVSA, just incurred in two financial operations. And in both of them, it had to get loans, it had to put exorbitant amounts of interest rate and yields in their bonds. Just to give you an example, in September of 2016, again, 1 year ahead of the sanctions, just to make a swap in their bonds from bonds that were maturing in 2017 towards new bonds that were maturing in 2020, just to make that swap worth $3.4 billion. The Venezuelan government had to offer the new bonds, so the bondholders swap. So the bonds only, so they need to give an interest rate, a yield of 21%. Plus, they need to put as a collateral Citgo refineries in the deal to secure the deal. Citgo refineries, they put 50.1% of the shares of Citgo, and that's worth $10 billion. And Citgo owns over 5,000 gasoline stations in the US, oil and gas pipelines across the nation, and it's the sixth biggest refinery network in the US because it has 750,000 barrels per day that it can refine. So for those reasons, you cannot attribute to the US sanctions the decline, the collapse in the oil industry. But rather, you need to go into what happened in the industry during those years since Chavez took office in 1998. Since then, he began attacking the independency of the oil industry. First, by firing 18,000 workers out of the 40,000 of the company. He fired all the management. He put all loyalists in the leadership of the company. And that, of course, will collapse production. It will collapse production because these people do not have the know-how that the engineers had. And you can see that in, for instance, the payroll of the company went from 40,000 to 150,000 workers. You can see that in the spike of accidents and spills in the oil industry. And you can see that by anecdotal evidence about the mismanagement of the sector, that they needed to put even more money to produce even less. So that was the first part of the collapse, the depletion of human capital of the oil industry. Then the second part of the collapse of the oil industry is because after having the operations politicized, then Chavez politicized the finances of the industry by creating a series of social development funds that had no accountability, that had zero accountability, and that it bring all the oil revenues from the oil industry. So he began using the excess money from the oil industry to pay for his social program, clientelar programs, domestically and abroad. Abroad, by creating alliances that gave cheap money to other countries that were aligned with the interest of the Venezuelan government. For instance, the ALBA organization, or through that way, the Venezuelan government also had the majority in the OAS. And domestically, he started creating series of ministries and social programs that had no accountability for clientelar purposes to win elections. And some of them maybe had some good results and outcomes, but there are a lot of evidence that I put in the paper that they were used as a political mechanism. So for that reason, then you had underinvestment in the company through all these years. Just to put you an example, in 2015, they were supposed to invest almost $50,000 million in the industry. They end up investing half of it. And out of the actual investment that year, a big chunk went to non-oil projects, such as subsidies for sectors as different as construction, agriculture, electricity supply. And yes, I will finish in 5 minutes. So we have the Q&A. So that was the collapse in the oil industry. Now let's go to the collapse on the non-oil sector, which many people, again, do not pay consideration. Many people link the collapse of the overall economy to the collapse of the oil economy. That's wrong. And we have several ways to prove it. They make their point because by 2014, for instance, the Venezuelan economy, 60% of its income was because of oil, more than 90% of its exports was because of oil, and almost 20% of the government revenues was because of oil. But the problem is that during the oil bonanza, during the oil boom, you start noticing problems in the Venezuelan economy. Problems that cannot be attributed to the decline of oil because they were living in a bonanza. For instance, Venezuela already had problems with inflation by 2013, while oil prices declined during the third quarter of 2014. Venezuela had already problems with budget deficits by then as well. Venezuela had already problems with shortages by then as well. And above all, and this is the most interesting thing, is that by 2013, Venezuela was already in a recession when oil prices began collapsing in 2014. And again, all of this after a huge oil bonanza, which means that there was something in the real economy that was simply not right. So there are several studies made to isolate the bonanza and just account the policies of the Chavez administration. And all these studies say that indeed the policies were causing issues, several issues. And to me, these are the two set of policies. The first one that is said about was the policies that try to substitute market mechanism for central planning. The first one of them was in 2001, when Chavez began his series of expropriations. Chavez expropriated, just to put you a number, over 1,000 companies in Venezuela. Between all expropriations, they account for $500 billion. So those are transfers from the private economy to the public sector. And that began as early as in 2001. Then in 2003, he implemented a series of currency controls towards the Venezuelan economy. And unbelievably, despite the currency controls, Venezuela averaged during those years $4,000 million, $4 billion in capital flights during these years. Then Chavez put a series of price caps in the Venezuelan economy since 2007. The price caps began with a series of items and ended with an overall nominal price caps of 30% of profit margins for all products, which destroyed the system of relative prices in Venezuela. And that's what gave rise to the series of shortages, which, by the way, you are not seeing right now because they make some liberalizations in that regard. And ultimately, the production quotas. When they start nationalizing the industry, when they start nationalizing manufacture, they begin putting production quotas, strict production quotas, and quotas towards exportation and importation. And all those policies create several issues in the real economy. And you can measure the amount of repression towards the economy of Venezuela by just looking Venezuela's ranking in the Index of Economic Freedom. Right now, Venezuela is just better than Cuba and North Korea in that regard, which means that the private sector in Venezuela does not have any type of freedom to invest, to commercialize their goods, to produce, to set prices. And this was the main issue of the Venezuelan economy. The second issue was in regards to the lack, and I will begin finishing with this, of the lack of the efficient provision of a series of institutions that are key for growth, such as monetary stability, fiscal stability, and public goods such as infrastructure, collective security, and even water and electricity supply. Venezuela became, in just a few years, the country with the worst inflation rate in the world. By 2013, Venezuela already had the highest inflation rate of any country. By 2017, it was already in hyperinflation. And by 2018, hyperinflation reached a million percent. Right now, it's at almost 4,000%, the hyperinflation. In terms of fiscal stability, as I said, Venezuela was running huge deficits from the early 2000s, which create issues later on. Just to put you an example, Venezuela owes in foreign debt almost $200,000 million, which is over 10 times its exports. And in terms of, for example, collective security, Venezuela became the most insecure country in Latin America and almost in the world because of the presence of the FARC, of the guerrillas, the lack of public investment in that regard, and the amount of drug dealing that occurs in Venezuela, which is particularly painful for agriculture, for instance. And overall, how can you produce in a country where you don't have electricity, when you don't have internet connectivity, when you don't have water supply? How can you open a restaurant without electricity and water supply? How can you be in agriculture without highways that are safe and are secure to transport your goods? All these are the problems that the Venezuelan economy needs to face. And these are not problems created by the external factors. These are problems created by policy, problems that created real issues. Venezuela is right now considered the worst place for doing business in the world. So just to finish with a couple of sentences before we go to the Q&A, because I know I went a little bit longer than I should. This is the main lesson that I think we need to draw from the Venezuelan collapse. It is a bad idea to have a state that wants to substitute and destroy the market, and a state that wants to expropriate private property, a state that wants to regulate and control the market. That's a bad idea. It's a failed idea. And in contrast, we need to have a free market and at the same time, a state that wants to complement the market. How? By providing public goods and institutions that enhance the power of the market and even mitigate some of the failures of the market. That way, you can use the power of the market, at the same time, the power of collective action. But they need to work together. The state can have a great role into enhancing the productivity of the market by giving them proper infrastructure, proper institution, monetary stability. But at the same time, it can destroy the market, just like it happened in Venezuela, if you try to substitute the market. So in that regard, I think that's the biggest lesson that the collapse of the Venezuelan economy can leave to the world, is that these institutions and these policies cannot be implemented anywhere else. So with that, thank you very much.